And our final speaker of the day is Amanda from the Washington University in St. Louis, and she's going to talk about algorithmic predictions in justice.
So hi, I am aware that I am the last speaker of the day on the last day of the conference, so thank you all for being here with me. I'm going to talk about our paper, Just Resource Allocation, how algorithmic predictions and human notions of justice interact. And this is joint work with Sanmay from George Mason and Patrick Fowler and Yevgeniy Vorobeychik, also from Washington University. What we're interested in here is looking at who should be prioritized for a scarce resource. And this question has been studied under the name of local justice in political philosophy and arises in many different contexts. So, for example, organ donation, military services, and also medical services. So if we're thinking of organ donation, often people will prioritize the most vulnerable patients or the sickest patients, like in the case of liver transplantation. Military services, if they're trying to choose who to draft for the military, it's often chosen based on lottery. And for medical services, when you think of medical triage, doctors are prioritizing patients who would benefit the most from treatment. And in our case, we are going to be focusing on two conceptualizations of local justice that are very commonly used. The first we're going to call vulnerability-oriented, and this corresponds with the idea of prioritizing the most vulnerable or the sickest patient for that liver. And the second is outcome-oriented, which is looking for the patient who's going to benefit most from medical services. And we're studying both of these in the context of homelessness. So the advent of algorithmic decision-making has brought with it the ability to make prioritization decisions in a more automated manner, often through providing decision support in the form of predictions from a model, something that gives additional information about who is seeking the scarce resource. And along with this, we've seen a lot of focus on the possible bias of those types of provided predictions or of those models. But what we're going to look at here is something that has not been studied as much, and that is the potential bias of an implementation or the potential fairness of implementing these types of predictive decision aids. And how might providing decision makers with predictions interact with their conceptualizations of justice to change how they might prioritize people for scarce resources? And what impact would those changes have on the institution's broader goals? To study this, we did a survey on Mechanical Turk of 520 participants. We had a couple of attention checks, which brought us down to 458. Our sample was of about 39% female, 86% white, and had an average age of 42 years. And we asked every participant to perform 3 tasks. And the context in which they were to perform these tasks looked like this. So assume we have 2 homeless households that are in need of services, and we have 1 central decision maker. This decision maker has to choose who to prioritize for, in this case, our scarce resource, which is transitional housing. Transitional housing is a more supportive homeless service that's often given to families with additional barriers to stability, such as disabilities or health concerns, and it's our scarce resource here because it usually costs more money to provide. If they're not prioritized for the scarce resource, they're going to get our baseline resource, which in this case is an emergency shelter. It's meant to provide an immediate response to homelessness, and it's what you would typically think of when you think of a homeless shelter. You're getting a bed for a short amount of time. So the households approach the decision maker has to decide who to prioritize, and they make their decision. Then the outcome that we want to know about is, are these households stably housed 2 years later? So did the service work? Is it helping them stay stable in their own housing, or are they needing future help? And we want to know if we provide a decision aid to that decision maker and those households now come in for services, how might that change the prioritization that that decision maker would make? And the decision aid that we look at here is we are supplying predictions of that outcome of interest. So whether or not those households might be stably housed 2 years later if given a particular allocation. And these predictions come from previous work that we've done using administrative data and machine learning to predict these counterfactual probabilities. And we bin these probabilities into low, medium, or high probability of reentry. And we had 3 hypotheses for this work. First, we felt that decisions would primarily fall into 2 types, and those are the 2 types I mentioned earlier, the outcome-oriented or the vulnerability-oriented. They're either going to prioritize people who would have the best future outcomes in transitional housing, or the people who might have the worst outcomes if placed in emergency shelter. Our second hypothesis comes from psychological literature. So we were interested in if prior exposure to predictions would introduce a framing effect, leading participants to make more outcome-oriented decisions later in the survey after being exposed to predictions earlier in the survey. And lastly, if we ask participants to make allocations and without giving them any goal, presenting them with algorithmic predictions would help reveal what their prioritization type is. They would better be able to represent that type. So focusing on the first hypothesis, the task in the survey that we used to study that was called the type elicitation task. So this was actually last in the survey. And we would provide them with a screen that looked like this. They had 2 households. We gave them only predictions of probability of reentry from our model as low, medium, and high, and they were asked to make a decision of which household they would prioritize for transitional housing. So in this case, if I was an outcome-oriented decision maker, I would be looking for the household that would have the lowest probability of reentry when put into transitional housing. So that's household 2 here, where they have the low probability in the top row. If I was a vulnerability-oriented decision maker, I would be looking for the household that has the highest probability of reentry if they are placed into emergency shelter. So that's our most vulnerable, our riskiest household, and that in this case would be household 1 with high in the last row. And for every decision like this that they made, we counted up how many outcome-oriented decisions and how many vulnerability-oriented decisions they make. And this is a distribution of those scores. So the vulnerability-oriented score on the left and the outcome-oriented score on the right. And we defined vulnerability-oriented types as those with a vulnerability-oriented score of 7 or above. So in this case, that is the group in black. And outcome-oriented types were those with outcome-oriented scores of 7 or above, which is the group in green. And you can see that they separate very clearly. It's very bimodal. And what we found was out of the 179 participants who weren't given a goal for this task, 94 revealed themselves to be vulnerability-oriented, 67 outcome-oriented, and only 18 didn't meet criteria for either group. So 90% of participants were very consistent in their decision-making, and we found that this was statistically significant. Our second hypothesis was that there would be a goal framing effect if we showed participants outcome predictions earlier in the survey, and they would make more outcome-oriented decisions later. And there were 2 tasks that we used to test this. The first is looking at the effect of training on classification. So all participants would be shown a table looking like this. It has 10 households on the columns, and each row has a piece of information about that household taken from our administrative data. So things like number of household members, number of children, disabilities, income. And based on that, they were asked to assign a probability of reentry to each household. So is it high probability of reentry in transitional housing, low probability, or medium? And half of participants were given training, half were given no training. So those in no training saw a very similar table. They were told that they would see a table similar to this later, to orient themselves to it, where the households were, what they're looking at, and to look for any patterns they might see. Those in the training group were shown the exact same table, but this time they were shown it paired with some probabilities of reentry. So in this case, households 1 and 2 are highlighted in red, and they would be paired with text that said, Models predict that the households highlighted in red have a high probability of needing services again within 2 years if they're given transitional housing. And they would see a series of these pages with different households highlighted and different probabilities of reentry given. The second task that we used to study this hypothesis was something we called the effect of algorithmic predictions task. And in this task, they were again given just 2 households and asked which should receive transitional housing. Half were given just what we call vignettes, so that's just that information about the households from our data. And half were given that along with predictions, which down here is in green. And what we saw is that combined, we had 4 different randomization groups, so either training or vignette only. And there was only one randomization group that never saw outcome predictions previously in the survey. So that is our group that didn't get any training and they only saw vignettes. And by an almost 2-to-1 ratio, those who had the prior exposure to outcome predictions, so those that are not highlighted, would reveal themselves to be outcome-oriented, while those without revealed themselves to be vulnerability-oriented by almost the same ratio. And these results were statistically significant. So we could split our data into 3 almost equal groups. So households that were not shown any outcome predictions, we might have a group that's outcome-oriented, a group that's vulnerability-oriented, and then when we show them outcome predictions, what we see is that part of that vulnerability-oriented group is now revealing themselves to be more outcome-oriented. So we have a group here that we call the infungible vulnerability-oriented. They're vulnerability-oriented, and they're going to remain so regardless of exposure to predictions. We have infungible outcome-oriented. They're going to remain outcome-oriented regardless of predictions. And then this group, which they were more susceptible to the framing, and we call them the vulnerability to outcome-oriented. So when they were exposed to outcome-oriented, or when they were exposed to outcome predictions, they move from being vulnerability-oriented to outcome-oriented. And in our last hypothesis, we thought that without any defined allocation goals, presenting participants with algorithmic information would help them adhere more to their type and show what type they are. And this is based on that effect of algorithmic predictions task. And it's important to note that that task came before the type revelation task, so they did not reveal their types until the end of the survey. But here I have them split by that type that they revealed at the end, at the bottom, so outcome-oriented or vulnerability-oriented types. And I'm showing their average outcome-oriented score. And these black bars are for the vignette-only group, so they had very similar outcome-oriented scores between the outcome-oriented types and the vulnerability-oriented types when not shown predictions. But when shown predictions, so this is the vignette and predictions group, we see that the outcome-oriented types are making many more outcome-oriented decisions. It's a dramatic increase in their scores, so they're becoming much more aligned with making outcome-oriented decisions. And our vulnerability-oriented group see their scores decline dramatically, showing that they're becoming much more aligned with making vulnerability-oriented decisions. And these differences were also statistically significant and very substantial in their effects. So what I want to make sure I say here is that no prioritization type is naturally better than the other. There's just competing priorities of what people feel like they should prioritize. And what we see is there's actually these same clashing priorities in the current homeless system. So current homeless policy states that we should prioritize people for housing based on risk. So this would coincide with a vulnerability-oriented prioritization. However, homeless services are often evaluated based on efficiency. And an example of that is the literature's focus and our use of that 2-year reentry metric. And that more closely corresponds to an outcome-oriented prioritization. So something like this could be exacerbated by the inclusion of an algorithmic decision aid that polarizes those 2 types. So really, implementation of these types of decision aids shouldn't be done without additional research into their effects on the institution more broadly. And it's very important to understand the morals involved in introducing these tools. And something that we're interested in doing in the future is replicating this work with homeless caseworkers to see how it works in the field. And we were funded by NSF and Amazon. And thank you.
We have time for quite a few questions, if there are any. So, yeah, if there are any, please come forward. Otherwise, maybe I have one. I was surprised to see, I think on your slide 26, like when you showed these black bars, that if I understand right, if people were not shown these predictions, the type barely made a difference in how people behaved.
Yes.
Does that mean, yeah, does it mean that people are really bad at predicting, like who will?
Yeah, so we did do some work looking into that. There could be a couple of things going on. One could be that they just have more information when we give them the predictions, so they're better able to show what their type is. They were always trying to make decisions that were consistent with their type, but now they can actually do that. There's less noise. There also could be an effect of framing as well, but that would mostly be in that vulnerability to outcome-oriented group. With the data that we had, that was kind of as far as we could tease it apart. But yeah, there could be multiple things going on there. Yeah.
Really interesting work. So the vulnerability, the way you're thinking about it is these vulnerability-oriented people want to prioritize, say, people who are at highest risk of re-entry into homelessness. The outcome-oriented people, you said, want to prioritize people for whom the intervention is most likely to succeed?
Yes, yes, exactly.
Okay, so I guess there's a third maybe type that I could imagine, which is sort of trying to maximize the marginal effect of the intervention, right? The difference between their likelihood of reentry if given, transitional housing versus a shelter.
Exactly.
So, did you look for that, or how does that compare to sort of an outcome-oriented approach?
Yeah, so we did look at that. In our context, when we're just binning into this low, medium, high, it really doesn't make that much of a difference looking at the marginal differences versus a more, I guess, greedy look. But if you bin it differently, so maybe looking at 10 bins or even looking at the exact probabilities of reentry, you do see more of a difference. So that is something that we would like to look at in future studies for sure.
Are there more questions? If we have time.
Yeah.
So given that people weren't able to accurately really predict whether people were vulnerable or not, did you see, did you run a regression to figure out what of the features then was predictive of how people would make these decisions?
How people would make the decisions. So what we did look at is that effective training, just to see how good they were at making the decisions. And we found that training did help them make better decisions, so they were able to better put together some patterns in the data. But altogether, even if you look at how well they were doing with training, they were still doing very badly. So in general, there weren't a lot of patterns to pick up, but it definitely is an interesting question. And we did see, so we had some spaces for people to leave comments, and we did have some people who would mention specific features in their comments, especially like people who weren't given a goal in a certain task. They would be like, I prioritize this person because they had more children or things like that. So we were able to pull some things out of those comments, but we would like to look more into that for sure.
Okay, thank you. Then let's conclude this session. Let's thank Amanda again, and let's thank all of our speakers.